In 1947, further attempts were made to stop Stalin's aggressive takeover of Eastern European countries. This was in direct response to a communist takeover attempt in Greece. This ultimately failed. It went on for about 3 years, but it inspired Truman to give economic aid to countries that were fighting communism, with the thought that if these countries, who were so poor after the war, actually had resources to stand up to Stalin, that maybe they wouldn't fall to communism. This meant he gave $400 million in aid to both Greece and Turkey that were threatened by communist takeovers. And this was pretty controversial because some Americans felt that we were interfering with the internal affairs of other nations, or that Americans' power would be spread too thin, or that we would be helping out what admittedly was an already corrupt government in Greece. And that's a common theme of the Cold War, is that a lot of times we were helping out countries just to prevent communism from spreading, but their governments themselves were certainly not democracies. The next step in the Cold War and in trying to prevent further influence of Stalin was something called the Marshall Plan. And this was created by the Secretary of State, George Marshall. He argued that Europe's economic recovery was necessary for world peace. And, Europe after World War II was in shambles. You can see from these pictures the devastation that happened throughout Europe. Factories after and during the war had been looted or bombed. There was little raw materials or power. Millions were out of work. There were many people in refugee camps. And so the idea was that we should offer some friendly aid, some friendly aid to help these countries get back on their feet. And while some thought it was too expensive, others favored it, fearing that communists might gain control of these economically weak countries. In February of 1948, the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia with tanks and took over the country, and this is what pushed Congress to agree to approve the Marshall Plan. In all, you can see that the Marshall Plan gave out $12.5 billion, and you can see that France and the United Kingdom or Great Britain got the most, and other countries got quite a bit as well. You will notice, however, that the Eastern European countries don't have any of that cash. Why is that? Well, because the Soviet Union and the Eastern European nations refused the aid. They claimed it was a plot to get them dependent on the U.S., and so Stalin refused and convinced other groups or other countries also not to accept the aid. The secret words for today are spring break. Okay, let's move on to what happened in 1948 and 1949. This was the Berlin Airlift. Now you remember we talked about how Germany at the Potsdam Conference was divided into 4 zones: the United States, Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain. And each of these countries ran their zones differently. The Soviets wanted to keep Germany weak so they couldn't attack again, and they also wanted to rebuild their own country. So they were actually taking resources out of East Germany and making East Germany even poorer and more run down than it was before. The other 3 countries, the United States, France, and Great Britain, decided to unite their zone, and they actually created a common currency. Their goal was the opposite. It was to strengthen Germany so it would be able to have a strong democracy. Now, what's interesting is that the capital of Germany is Berlin. That is located in the eastern part of Germany. So therefore, it was located within the Soviet zone. The other 3 countries, the US, France, and Great Britain, did not want the Soviet Union to have total control of the capital, which is, of course, the most powerful and important city in the country. So Berlin was also divided into 4 zones. So they actually had controlled parts of the city that were in the eastern part of Germany. Now, and you can see here a picture of how West Berlin does so much better than East Berlin because what are they getting? Marshall Plan aid, and they're getting money. And the western part of Berlin and West Germany were being rebuilt through this. Now, the problem arose for Stalin in Berlin because, this is a city, and people in Berlin, in the eastern part of Berlin, could see how prosperous the other sectors were compared to theirs. And in addition, Stalin did not like having these three countries in the capital and located in East Germany, so he wanted them out, but he didn't have the power. It was 1948. The United States had the atomic bomb. The Soviets did not at that point. So what he decided to do was to order the closing of all rail lines, canals, and roads that entered West Berlin through the Russian sector, basically isolating West Berlin. So that was a problem because that meant that supplies of food and fuel were cut off, and the inhabitants of West Berlin only had enough food to last them for 36 days and coal for 45 days. The only way for the Allies to supply their sectors in Berlin was to actually fly in supplies. They knew this was safe because Stalin wouldn't dare to shoot down Allied planes with America's atomic supremacy. The flights lasted for 11 months until Stalin gave in. 327 days, 277,000 flights, 2.5 million tons of supplies. So it was quite impressive, and it was definitely a success because Stalin finally gave up. And here's a few more photos of all the supplies being delivered.